What's up? Thanks for tuning in. Breath of Black Flag once again. And I wanted to go on a quick rant here. Well, we'll see how quick it is. But I wanted to talk about globalism and globalization. And specifically, as the title of this video will read after it's posted, the inherently anti-globalist position of libertarianism. Of course, I'm going to use a very narrow definition of globalism, which really doesn't seem to be, as I'm reading on Wikipedia. I'll use Wikipedia probably as for a lot of reference in this, but regardless of that, I mean, you can just get the gist of what these people mean when they talk about it, when they use these words, regardless of what the political scientists have published and stuff. Popular appeal and and what everybody is saying outside of the scholarly circles is really kind of what's seems to be a little bit more important, because if the masses believe something, they're more likely to accept certain things based on those definitions and so on and so forth. People act on their beliefs, right? So if they think globalism mean one thing, then that's what it's going to mean in context of conversation with them. And what it seems to mean to the so-called conservatives and so-called right-wingers and the nationalists is the idea of, or the imposition of, a singular global state, a one world government. That seems to be what they're worried about, right? Because it's anti-globalist propaganda and stuff is always, or literature, not necessarily propaganda in a bad sense, but anti-globalism movements tend to highlight the UN and other and the EU and the previously kicked around concept of the North American Union, stuff like that. They tend to use that as a signifier of globalism. And so clearly what they mean is the concept of a singular global state eventually would be the case, even if it were just several so-called super nations or coalitions of three nations, or something like how in 1984 was put out, there's three super states left over or whatever. If it was like the EU, the NAU, and some Asian coalition or something that became the three main states. But so that's what they're talking about, right? They're talking about a single state. But I'm going to read some of the political science definitions here, and then I'm probably going to critique some of it as I was looking through it. So Paul James is apparently political. Let's see who he is. Professor of Globalization and Cultural Diversity at Western Sydney University, Director of the Institute for Culture and Society, where he's been since 2014. So those are Paul James' credentials, and they quote him. He defines globalism, quote, at least in its more specific use, as the dominant ideology and subjectivity associated with different historically dominant formations of global extension. Okay, so maybe soak that in. That's a pretty long-winded definition, but if you think about it, you can get what he's saying. The ideology tied to whichever group is he's saying historically dominant. That might be like a postmodernist thing here. I wouldn't necessarily see that I wouldn't see that as being necessary, whether they're dominant or not. If they're out there attempting to do this, then that's what they're doing, right? So different historically dominant formations of global extension. So the quote global extension, be it through political, and they do lump market means and stuff like that. So, and to me, in economics, that seems more like, if you kept that to the market activity, the global extension of trade, the interdependence or inter-exchanges of trade through farther expanses due to technology, that would be globalization, right? And I'll get into, hopefully, if I remember, I should probably write down notes before I do these, but this all just kind of ad-lib based off a little idea I have. So, but then it continues, the definition thus implies that there were pre-modern or traditional forms of globalism and globalization long before the driving force of capitalism sought to colonize every corner of the globe. And I'm going to stop here because this is where I wanted to critique this a little bit, is that a colony is an inherently government, a concept that is inherently tied to government, not capitalism, not markets. I guess you could use that in a certain sense, but tied to markets, but not really. A colony is a government entity, right? Like, that's who colonizes the world. And yeah, they might institute what they call a market, and there might be exchange and trade and stuff like that under a guise of free market principles. But if there's a foreign state that is controlling an area far away from them and has declared it as their little jurisdiction, that's a colony. That's the government that does that. So Capitalism doesn't seek to, quote, colonize anything. The state is who colonizes things, areas, and people. So anyway, he says, for example, going back to the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD and perhaps the Greeks in the 5th century BC. Okay, so again, though, I mean, I don't know who thinks that Roman Empire is an example of capitalism. I mean, yeah, there was markets and stuff taking place. I mean, there were markets in that time period and that, but the people with ties to the market and businesses and property and stuff, even though it was a pretty classist system, right? So I don't know if they would have still considered that feudalism. Probably back then, most socialist historians and stuff, they might consider that still feudalism. I'm not sure exactly where their timelines rest at this point, but I don't think anybody in the free market camp would ever say that the Roman Empire was an example of market capitalism. There are people with business interests that want the Roman Empire to go and then colonize and force their customs on the foreigners, but that's not what a free market involves, right? So there's just a lot of confusion there between the concept of markets, globalization, and colonization, which is a state enterprise. So Manfred Steger, let's see who they are real quick, is professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He is also professor of global studies and director of the Globalism Research Center at RMIT University in Australia until 2013. So these people study specifically globalism, apparently. Distinguishes between different globalisms, such as justice globalism, jihad globalism, and market globalism. And I think that most free market people would consider market globalism to be globalization. That's what we would say by that. So market globalism includes the ideology of neoliberalism, which is just liberalism, which in a sense is true, right? In a sense, like you don't necessarily have to expand trade. It's just something that happens. But hopefully what we want to happen is that markets will intertwine as technology gets better and we have further reach to trade with other people who have access to resources that we wouldn't have, right? So we would trade with them. So in that sense, the market becomes global, which is a good thing and has happened in incredible, leaps and bounds since the 20th century, 19th century even. And I mean, I guess it was taken off maybe in the 15th and 16th century, what we would consider, contemporary society spread throughout from Europe over to the western side of the planet and all that. So relative, I guess, Western. So in some hands, the reduction of globalism to the single ideology of market globalism and neoliberalism has led to confusion. I don't understand why it would. Well, I would because this is the thing, is globalism, as they have mentioned, I guess I misread that. So globalism seems to be largely tied to political issues. They cited a bunch of political issues. They cited the Roman Empire, political entity. They cited colonies, a political entity. They called it capitalism, however. And granted, there were people who were in the role of capitalist in certain ways that wanted the state to go and conquer other areas to get access to their resources and so on. But that doesn't mean that that's a free market capitalist enterprise. That would be violation of those indigenous people's property rights, right? Right. So, but yeah, there would be confusion. I could see if you use globalism and globalization to mean the same thing, but not at the same time, right? Like that's what maybe people are doing, which is something actually, I guess maybe I'll get to now. I mentioned earlier, the so-called right-wingers, they rail against stuff like Chinese goods coming into the country and goods coming from other countries, and that's globalization, right? Granted, the Chinese are not the most free market society, by any stretch, but our area, so-called United States, would be in a so-called liberal state if these goods were just allowed to come and go without any so-called tariffs or customs or any government involvement whatsoever in the sale of goods and services. They would just be going from seller to buyer or to the market and so on. So, and if you mean globalism in a political sense, which is what the conservatives also mean, because they are talking about one world government, but at the same time, They are railing against things which are the product of technology and the globalization of the marketplace. So, sure, that could lead to confusion because that's two different things, right? So, if you try to use them as the same way, which conservatives seem to do that, like I said. So, interesting concepts. But anyway, um, so I guess the last part of that is irrelevant, this little paragraph here. But so that's basically kind of laying out globalism and the differences between globalism and globalization. And now, the reason libertarianism is inherently anti-globalist, not globalization, meaning the interplay of production and exchange at a global level due to technology, which is allowed by technology, transportation, and communication, mostly. So, globalism, in the sense of the singular world state, is clearly an anti-libertarian position, since essentially logically consistent libertarians would be anarchists. So naturally, that would imply one global state is also fundamentally illegitimate, which it would be, and it is. But really, there's a couple different points about this. It's not just the ethical issue and the violation of liberty. That's one point, and to me, that's the main point, because if that were understood, the next 2 points, which are essentially, I guess you want to call them pragmatic points, would be irrelevant, because we would all understand that this was immoral to begin with and why it's immoral. But on the pragmatic side, the logistics of a single global state attempting to govern 7 billion people, 8 billion people, however many we're at now, is just ridiculous. The bureaucracy would be so immense it would probably collapse under its own weight. And that's why, in my view, I don't really think that these people who are actually, quote, globalists and want a singular state, they don't really want a singular state. They want several different groups like the NAU and the EU and stuff. It just seems to me that would be more manageable for them to do than attempt to govern 7 billion people, right? It's logistically impossible. And also just the information aspect of it is the second point of the pragmatic opposition, is that how could people on the other side of the planet know what's best for a society, on the other side of the planet, basically? I guess we have this technology to communicate and everything, but there's different cultural values, there's different social values, and different market values and things that would come into play. And again, now we revert back to the ethical issues, that they really have no right to be telling other groups of people how they need to engage in society, aside from the general claims that, if the only things that a quote anarchist would consider legitimate action, right? Stopping murderers, rapists, thieves, people who commit fraud, and so on. So it's not that. Well, what I mean to say here then now is that the issue with the anti-globalist movement is that, or the differences here is that you can be an anti-globalist and not be a Nazi, right? The issue that sparked this whole thing was that somebody was basically like saying neo-Nazis try to hide their movement and call it anti-globalist and all these other things. And I was like, well, being anti-globalist isn't necessarily bad. You're not necessarily a Nazi if you're an anti-globalist. I mean, all libertarians would inherently be anti-globalist, as in, if by globalism you mean a singular world state. For the pragmatic and the ethical issues of it, it would just be a horrible nightmare. I mean, it's essentially slavery, as all government implies, justified slavery, though there's no such thing. But the logistics of it would just be horrendous. It would, or it would just collapse, and then we wouldn't even have to worry about it, because there'd just be no way that they could continue on. There would just be no way to control 7 billion people by one force. Of course, their force would probably be quite big, but it would be interesting. I'm not sure, tally up all of the enforcement agents of all of the governments in the world and see how many that is. And then we could say, like, if there were a singular state, maybe they would have a similar number. Maybe. But then you could kind of see like what they would really be able to do when it comes to enforcing their commands. Probably not much. The resources and time and information required to govern 7 billion people through a singular centralized entity just seems to be completely absurd and logistically impossible. So But it's like, again, aside from that, though, and aside from the entire concept of violation of property rights, the nationalists have the wrong answer, though, right? This is basically the whole point of this. 15 minutes into it is that the nationalists have the wrong answer. The answer to globalization, the problem of globalization, the idea of it, because if you mean a singular global state, I would agree it is a problem. It's just understanding what government is and abolishing the state. Because if you want to do a nationalist state, you're really no different. You just have confined it to some smaller area of the globe. You're doing all the same things. You're controlling who comes and goes. You're governing people. You're forcing them to pay for the state through taxation. You're violating innocent people's property rights and things by nature, as a state does. So the nationalists, you're not necessarily a nationalist socialist if you're opposed to globalization. The thing here is that you are a national socialist if you want the state to use force to prevent natural market globalization. I might have said that wrong earlier. You're not necessarily a Nazi if you're against globalism, but you essentially are a Nazi or a communist if you want the state to use force to control the natural globalization, that is the expansion of trade through to a global scale due to technology. So just some thoughts on these concepts and maybe clear some things up if people are still kind of using these terms all scatty and whatnot. But so libertarianism, again, it's inherently anti-globalist, but that doesn't mean that we support immigration control. That doesn't mean we side with national socialists in that matter. Though I know a lot of people who call themselves libertarians say that they want border control and yada, yada, yada. But I think if you listen to the more scholarly libertarians and the ones who've been around for a while and you read the older texts, you understand that no, immigration control is not consistent with libertarianism. There's no way to rationalize it with the welfare state or anything. So, the answer to both the welfare state and immigration control and globalism is all the same thing. It's abolish the state. Don't do that. Don't do those things. It's illegitimate and so on. And the nationalists basically advocate the same thing, just at a smaller, more localized level. And the realization that must be had is that all states are inherently illegitimate because they impose themselves on nonviolent people by way of taxation. They say we are in the marketplace, and in fact we force you to pay us, and nobody else can be in this area of the marketplace, this sector of the marketplace, at least not without our permission, and they will be very limited. They won't be able to do the same things. Obviously, they can't have a, quote, legislature that operates in the same manner as the state, because it's a monopoly, and obviously if anybody else were to do that, they would actually be criminals. The issue is that the people who believe in government don't realize that they too are criminals when they do those things that they say are criminal if others did them. So libertarianism, again, inherently anti-globalist, not anti-globalization. Those are two different things. Free trade is good. Abundance of goods is a good thing. If they're inferior, don't buy them. They'll go out of business eventually. But yeah, so end rant, abolish the state.